Hey everybody, you are listening to Renewalcast, a weekly podcast that features interviews, discussions, and teaching on various biblical and theological subjects. And we do this because we believe that our minds are to be shaped and renewed by the life-giving and transforming Word of God through the power of the Holy Spirit. So we pray that for the next few minutes as you listen, you will see Jesus more clearly. Today on the podcast, we're going to continue in our series on eschatology, on end times. We're talking about premillennialism. We've looked at dispensationalism. Now we're going to talk about what is called historic premillennialism. So we have a guest with us today. Craig Blomberg is with us, and he is going to help us as we look at this issue. So hope you enjoy the show. Hey everybody, welcome to Renewalcast. Today we are continuing on in our series on the end times and different views that people hold when it comes to the return of Christ and the nature of that return. So today we have a guest with us. Craig Blomberg is with us today, and we're going to talk about historical premillennialism. So Craig, would you just thank you for being with us and agreeing to help us out and understand this issue. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Would you just take a few minutes and tell us a little bit about yourself and your ministry? And
sure,
we'd love to hear about you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm glad I don't have to correct your pronunciation of historic premillennialism. I do have to correct your pronunciation of Blomberg. I just
Blomberg.
have one O in my last name, but I've given up the fight because until you add me to Microsoft Word's dictionary, it auto-corrects Blomberg to Bloomberg. Just can't compete with billionaire owners of news services and former politicians.
Apologize for that. I just have heard of
all the world
Blomberg
does
before.
what you do, so I've come to expect it. I have just recently officially retired from ministry of teaching New Testament studies at Denver Seminary for the past 36 years, but I continue to try to give new meaning to that acronym RHINO so that it means retired in name only. And I do some part-time teaching still for the seminary and for some other schools. I'm still writing as much as ever and doing things like this with you guys today. So it's very enjoyable. I don't know what else you want to know about me. I have one wife, 2 daughters, and 3 grandchildren. And the oldest daughter that has 3 grandchildren married a Brit and is bringing them up in England. So we had delightful 2 weeks with them at Christmas. It's the first time they were able to travel this way in 6 years. And given that the 2 youngest grandchildren are only 3, it's the first time they got to be in the U.S. So that's a little bit about me.
Sounds good.
You've written some books. I know I have your book on 1 Corinthians. I think you've maybe written some other commentaries too, and something on I can't remember the title, on the Gospels, the historical nature of the Gospels. Benefited from some of your other work as well.
Yeah, thank you. I've also done commentaries on Matthew and James, and I'm currently significantly expanding and revising the one on Matthew for the new Christian Standard Bible Commentary series that B&H Academic and Lifeway is putting out. And I've written a lot on the reliability of the Gospels. I've written a lot on interpreting the parables, which was my interest for my PhD dissertation. I've done some things on money matters and stewardship, and thanks to nearly 30 years of dialogue, have written on Mormon evangelical conversations and dialogues, and lots of other stuff.
For our topic today, you have a book on historical premillennialism, right?
It's true, which I probably never would have done except for my very zealous colleague, Dr. Sung-Wook Chung, who is Korean by upbringing, but trained at Harvard and Oxford and has taught for us for now about 20 years. And eschatology is a huge interest of his.
Well, that's a pretty good segue. Would you just Briefly explain historical premillennialism.
Sure. There's two parts to it. If you want to boil down the options for relating the millennium, the picture of Revelation 20 of 1,000 years in which Christ reigns on earth, that has spawned three major views over church history, and you just have to keep your prefixes straight. The premillennial view says that Christ returns before the millennium, which is what a straightforward reading of Revelation 19 and 20 suggests. Christ's return comes in chapter 19, and then the millennium in chapter 20, and chapters 21 to 22 end the Bible with the picture of the new heavens and new earth. There is also a post-millennial view that says that with the help of the Spirit, God's people increasingly Christianize the earth, and the millennium is the last long period of time before Christ returns, or to keep the statements parallel, Jesus comes back after the millennium, hence postmillennial. And the third view is the amillennial view, where like in atypical or other words like that, simply means not. There is no literal millennium, but the period of Christian history between Christ's first and second comings is seen spiritually as the time when Christ reigns on earth. And therefore, Jesus' return is not related to a literal prolonged period of time called the millennium. Now, you can start subdividing those three views. And I won't do the other two, but premillennial, for the first 1,800 or so years of church history, perhaps a little bit more, the major form of premillennialism was what we would call post-tribulationist. That is to say, Jesus comes back before the millennium, but he comes back after that period that both testaments in various places call a great tribulation, or a time of great distress that seems to surround the end times. In 1830, John Nelson Darby, an Irish pastor who ministered largely in Ireland and Scotland, developed a view that has come to be known as dispensational premillennialism. And it really has had much more influence on the United States and places that we have sent missionaries around the world than it ever did in the British Isles or in Ireland. But this is the view that breaks the history of humanity into distinct periods or dispensations, and with respect to the end times, sees that there will be a separate secret rapture of the church a number of years, often thought to be 7, before Christ returns publicly and visibly. And this view is probably the most significant view that would today distinguish a dispensationalist premillennial person from the classic or historic premillennial person. And if you're still with me, I better stop there.
That's good. So what would be the biblical support for the historic premill view?
There are a lot of prophetic passages. Perhaps the most extensive and dramatic begins in the middle of Isaiah 65 that appear to depict a glorious restored Israel, but going beyond Israel with the nations of the world streaming to Israel, a restoration of all humanity worldwide to the extent that anybody there and then envisaged it. And yet it seems to stop short of perfection. It talks about someone who lives for 100 years will not be considered old, or who dies after 100 years will not be considered old. But there still seems to be sin and death in the universe. In the New Testament, there are hints in various books, but sooner or later, the debate tends to come down to the book of Revelation, the only place that the actual word millennium appears, which comes from a Latin word, actually, meaning 1,000-year period, is in Revelation chapter 20. And so the question there becomes, is this intended to be a separate period of time between Christ's return and the dissolution of the cosmos as we know it and the recreation of new heavens and new earth, which the most straightforward reading sequentially, chapter by chapter, of that part of the book of Revelation would suggest. As far as the tribulational piece goes, again, people bring up lots of different texts, and maybe you'll want to do that. But for me, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is a very significant one, where in the last paragraph of that chapter, the Apostle Paul is describing how believers will be caught up to be with the Lord and will be ever with him. And this is described in the context of the final resurrection of all believers, using a term. The Greek word is apantesis, that simply means a meeting. Some translations say to meet the Lord in the air. A little bit more literally, it would be for meeting with the Lord. This is a term that not always, but often referred to a welcoming party that would leave the walled portion of an ancient city upon hearing the news of the impending arrival of a coming king or dignitary or triumphant general in battle. And that welcoming party would head down the road outside of the city in the direction the other person was coming, meet up with them, and then turn around and escort them back to the city as a celebration, and some kind of victory feast would often follow. If that is the image that Paul is drawing on, then whether you take it at a literal height that can be measured so many feet or yards or miles off the ground, or you simply take it more metaphorically, you have a picture here of God's faithful as Christ is returning, forming that kind of a welcoming party. And so once they meet him, to carry on with the imagery, they usher him back to earth in triumph. It's not the idea that they go away with him to heaven to be to remain there for 7 years before everybody comes back.
So a lot of times, I think the people in the pew will talk about their views of end times, and they'll use pre-trib, post-trib. They'll talk about it maybe that way.
Right.
So really what we're talking about is the dispensational side would be the pre-trib, the historical premillennial would be a post-trib, right?
With
so Jesus is coming.
Tiny handful of exceptions who've tried to mix and match things differently. That is correct.
Okay. Yeah, just to kind of help maybe people understand
Absolutely
where we're coming from a little bit here. So are there some variations within historical premillennialism? Can you kind of outline?
There certainly are. And I suppose one of the biggest ones is, how literally do you take 1,000 years? One of the objections to premillennialism from the amillennial side is that numbers are consistently symbolic throughout the book of Revelation. 1,000 is a round number. It was even in ancient Greek for a good long period of time. And so you will find those who say the point is not the chronology of the millennium, but its nature. And it's interesting that in the early church, there was often the belief that this was the Sabbath rest period for earth. And when ancient Judaism at times believed that they were living in what we call the first century, in about 4,000 years after creation. It was easy to imagine another couple thousand years and then a millennium. For those who are old enough in our audience to remember the year 2000 and the books that were written in the late 90s preceding up to it, that argument was trotted out over and over and over again as a reason to expect the impending Y2K crisis when all the computers of the world were going to crash as ushering in the millennium. In case anybody didn't notice, it didn't work out that way. But so is the millennium a literal period of time? Is it just a round number for a good long period of time? Or is it not trying to depict a length of time at all, but simply say that there will be discrete vindication, triumph, reward for God's faithful saints that is marked out as something believers can look forward to? Some would even limit it to those who have been martyred for their faith. And then what I suspect virtually everyone agrees on in this view, what we really long for is not an imperfect millennium, however good it is, but the completely perfect new heavens and new earth that the Bible ends with. That's what Christians ought to agree on and celebrate.
Are there some errors that some within the camp make?
Well,
not as many as in dispensationalism, probably.
My error is the strength of your position on any topic. Sure, I can say there are unsolved problems. What do we do with the fact that Isaiah 65 also speaks of new heavens and new earth, but they don't seem to be quite perfect yet? What do we do with the fact that there seem to be places in Revelation to make sense of it that you have to put a flashback, especially in chapter 12, that begins with a vision of a male child about to be born who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. That's an allusion to Psalm 2 and seems to refer to the birth of the Messiah. That, after chapter 11, led us to believe we were halfway through the tribulation in the end times. I would prefer not to call these errors because I don't think they're on the level of someone who denies the Trinity or the deity of Jesus or salvation by faith. But there are certainly things that people disagree with each other on within the view.
Let me ask you this. When in interpreting the book of Revelation, do all historical premillennialists then approach the book of Revelation primarily from a futurist perspective?
Typically, and the word primarily is important there. I think of someone like Grant Osborne, who was one of my teachers years ago at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, now with the Lord, wrote a huge and wonderful commentary on the book of Revelation in the Baker Exegetical Commentary series. And he readily acknowledges that every view on interpreting Revelation has some strengths, has some contribution to make. But having said that, he then says, yes, he is primarily futurist. I sometimes will describe my view as primarily futurist, but with a significant amount of the preterist view. The fully preterist view is hard to swallow. That's the one that says everything short of new heavens and new earth in Revelation is describing events from the first century. Particularly surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And in fact, that's Christ's return, his invisible coming in judgment on Jerusalem by the Roman armies. But if the point of the preterist view is to say, whatever we make of Revelation had to be understandable and intelligible to first century Christian readers, then I'm in 100% agreement. We have to understand what something John sees in one of his visions would have conjured up in the minds of a first century Christian listener. rather than to take a now somewhat famous example from the 52-year-old book by Hal Lindsey, Late Great Planet Earth, when the grasshoppers or locusts from the abyss in chapter 9 of Revelation are described as armed helicopters. Well, there isn't a person in John's original audience who could have imagined that, and therefore it's almost certainly wrong.
Yeah, I grew up in a church that those kind of things were commonplace in understanding the book of Revelation. And I remember going to Bible college and picking up J. Stuart Russell's book, The Parousia. And of course, it's almost a commentary on any passage that has to do with the end. And he interprets it all preterist. And I just remember thinking, all these people that were reading these things had to understand this. And then you have to ask the question, okay, how far do you take this? So I think you're exactly right. You have to come to that conclusion that, okay, what's the purpose of understanding it this way? And I think you're right that we do look forward to
there's no question that the terrible empire of Romans 17 is described as Rome, the woman who sits on a city of 7 hills. We have coins minted that have been discovered from that era with the goddess Roma sitting on the 7 hills. And she's the one who has blasphemously persecuted the saints and mingled their blood with pagan offerings. And there's no question it's Rome. But the question is that all it is? Or is the point that John can also call this great harlot as from Babylon? Well, Babylon, modern day Iran, nowhere close to ancient Rome. And Revelation 10 can say that some of these things happen in Jerusalem. So is God just giving John completely confusing pictures, or is the point to make people think of the desecration of a holy city by a horrible end times empire wherever in the world it may be centered or based? And interestingly, throughout most of church history, most of the differing positions have agreed at least on that much. Revelation doesn't tell us the location of where the empire will be based, but it gives us a detailed and horrifying description of what it's going to be like.
Are a lot of historical premill partial preterists?
In a non-technical sense, yes, I think so. There is such a thing as partial preterism that is a technical term, and then that commits you to saying certain things are first century, certain things aren't. But if the question is simply, do historic premillennialists typically believe that everything John wrote was completely or reasonably intelligible to most of his original audience in light of first century realities, then yes, definitely.
So who would have been, or who are some people that hold this view? If somebody wants to kind of do some further reading, we mentioned that you have a book on this, and we would certainly point people to that. But historically, you mentioned that.
Historically, there's been a lot of debate as to who held the upper hand in the first 300 years or so of church history. And since we only have a tiny fraction of all the evidence that once existed, and to our knowledge, nobody ever took a census asking what view different people held, that debate will probably continue to go on. But certainly Irenaeus, writing in around 180, building on piecemeal hints and fragments from church fathers such as Ignatius and Polycarp, Barnabas, the shepherd of Hermas, Justin Martyr. Irenaeus is one of the famous exponents of it. As you move beyond his time into the 3rd and 4th centuries, you get Hippolytus and Lactantius are key promoters. In the book that Sung Wook Chung and I edited on a case for historic premillennialism, a very renowned church historian, Don Fairbairn, who has taught at Gordon Conwell, particularly the Charlotte campus, for many years, makes what I think is a persuasive argument that premillennialism probably did have a slight advantage, have the upper hand. But when Augustine, who with his City of God and so many other works in the early 400s really set the tone for 1,000 years of Roman Catholic theology, he took an amillennial viewpoint. And so in the history of Catholic and Eastern Orthodoxy, you do not find much of any views other than amillennial ones. At the time of the Protestant Reformation, as was true on a number of secondary issues, Calvin and Luther did not break from Roman Catholic teaching as much as some of the later so-called radical reformers, particularly in Anabaptist circles, Mennonite circles. Menno Simons, the founder of the Mennonite movement. Although, as again the centuries march by and Puritanism develops, you do find a minority of Puritan thinkers, people like Increase Mather and his more famous son, Cotton Mather, who took a premillennial view. And then in the 19th century, with the settling of America by European immigrants, this was the age of so much eschatological speculation. God was, in their minds, so clearly doing such a new thing in bringing this huge continent under European control. And this is a time when postmillennialism flourishes. We're going to Christianize the earth. But it's also a time when all kinds of people start to set dates for the return of Christ, some of them in what today we would think of as sects or cults, but some of them in more mainstream evangelical Christianity. Somebody as revered as Charles Haddon Spurgeon in England was a premillennialist and not of the dispensational variety. In the 20th century, probably the single most well-known individual, spent his entire career teaching at Fuller Seminary. It was George Eldon Ladd, who defended this in a number of books. But there were plenty of other people whose names come readily to mind, like Francis Schaeffer or Carl F.H. Henry, or even more recently, Don Carson, who chairs the Gospel Coalition after a long career of teaching at Trinity and Deerfield. There are entire schools and entire denominations like the Evangelical Free Church, like the Conservative Baptist denomination out of which Denver Seminary was birthed, that for a long period of time required faculty, trustees to be premillennialists. And one of the ways that they were able to maintain that was by allowing for historic as well as dispensational premillennialism, because there does seem to be a trend. I want to say this appropriately because I have some very good scholarly friends, Darrell Bach being probably the most well-known, who are progressive dispensationalists, and I admire him greatly. But there does seem to be a general trend that dispensationalism has emerged as a grassroots populist movement rather than a movement from theologians with influence, and that the more education you get, if you allow yourself to be exposed to all the options, the more likely you will move away from dispensationalism. But with historic premillennialism as a middle ground where you can camp, a lot of people have done so.
Have you had people or noticed that there's any unfair caricatures of the historic premill view?
Caricatures, yeah. Maybe the one I remember from my young adult years the most is I was trying to figure out if I could settle in one of these camps or if I had to be the proverbial pan-millennialist and say it was just all going to pan out in the end, was the caricature that said, well, if you're post-tribulational, that's just the pogo stick theology. You've got these believers on earth, and like a giant pogo stick, they jump up into the air to welcome Christ and then just bounce right back down on earth. And well, that's just silly, which I agree if it was about a pogo stick. But once I learned that nobody knew about pogo sticks in Paul's day, and they did have this idea of a welcoming party, an escort party, then I thought, oh, well, that does make sense.
You maybe mentioned a few already, but are there some difficulties with your position? And maybe it's a caricature too.
There are difficulties with every position. There are difficulties because the typical premillennialist, and this would be true of all the different kinds, sees human beings who are not followers of Jesus, but alive at the time of his return, continuing to live on into at least part of the millennium. And yet, apparently, they are surrounded by and interacting with those believers who have been raised from the dead and have resurrected, glorified bodies. And those who were alive when Christ came back were transformed without having to experience death. Isn't this something for Avatar or for some sci-fi fantasy? Redeemed and unredeemed people, even nature of their bodies mingling together. And I'm the last one to say there's a simplistic or easy answer to that, but I'm struck by the fact that if we seriously believe in a bodily, physical resurrection of the Lord Jesus, then we already have a precedent at the time of Christ's resurrection, the 40-day period in which he, with a glorified, resurrected body, mingled with still unglorified humans who would have to die and decay and then be raised at a later point. And if we take the enigmatic little text in Matthew 27:51-53 about the resurrection of some other Old Testament saints at this time, then there's more people that cause a problem for us. And so it does seem to be consistent with what Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 15 about Jesus' resurrection being the first fruits of all of our resurrections. If he and perhaps some others in the first century who were raised hung around with, however briefly, mere mortals, then why could it not happen again? I suppose the other problem is just that people want to ask all kinds of questions that the texts don't answer. Do people have babies? Do they get married? Does that matter? If you make it into the millennium, do you live until the end? As in so many things in theology, when the Bible is silent, we get really curious and we start to speculate, and the overconfident among us start to write books. And we probably need to avoid that.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's one of the reasons why there's not just an overwhelming consensus amongst Christians on these views, even within each camp,
right.
Because we do humbly acknowledge that, boy, sometimes we just got to step back and say, this is as far as the Bible goes. So how do we get along, or where is the line between us and people that have a differing view on this issue? We kind of said already, full preterism is outside of the bounds, a view that says Christ has already come back. But between premillennialism, postmillennialism, all-millennialism, how do we get along?
I have virtually no lines or boundaries to draw. I remember, again, I mentioned Grant Osborne, when he would talk about the principle of evangelical unity with agreement on matters of primary significance and willingness to disagree on matters of secondary significance. These eschatological debates were always one of the first things he would mention in that category. And if someone is interested in having a conversation with why I believe what I believe, of course, I'm going to tell them. And if I am surveying the New Testament, as I've done regularly for several decades in various classes, I am not going to make sure that I'm behind on the syllabus so that I never quite get to Revelation. I won't mention names of people who might have done that in the history of academia, but I will tell people my best shot at what I think, but then explain this should be something you sit very loose on. Look for the themes that emerge from prophecy and apocalyptic literature rather than these kind of details. A book that probably not many people remember now was one that Eugene Peterson wrote, I think in the late 80s, called Reversed Thunder. And it sort of looks like a popular level commentary on Revelation, but it's really a series of chapters on the main themes of Revelation as they emerge sequentially in the differing chapters. And it is just rich and full of so much relevant teaching. And if you don't pick up on the relevance, he makes sure that you do, just like he did, of course, in his paraphrase of the Bible, The Message. And those are the types of things I think that we need to point people to that can be very unifying elements among us.
Yeah. Well, we like to ask that question on this particular subject because we want that answer. We don't want to be a platform where people are divided and say, well, I take this view.
I'm glad to hear that.
But we need to, I think these conversations are extremely important to have, to understand why we believe what we believe. But at the same time, they need to be in the proper place as far as importance.
That's right. Right.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us today, taking some time to be on out of your schedule. And Jay, you have anything you want to ask at the end?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right.
Appreciate your work.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for your interest and the agenda behind that interest. It resonates with me completely.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. You can find more out about us or check out past episodes on the web at renewalcast.com. You can connect with us on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/renewalcast. Have a great week.